So good afternoon and welcome to our latest VI webinar. My name's Phil Jarvis and I'm the chair of the voluntary initiative. And today's subjects are Propyzamide product and pest management. And I'm delighted to be joined by Joe Martin, who's going to be talking, who's from Contiva Agri-Science, and is going to be talking about some of their initiatives. I'm also joined by a soil specialist from Agravista, which is Ollie Johnson, and Spencer Collins from the NFU will be talking about NFU plans. The format is as follows, that we'll have 3 10-minute presentations and then we'll have a question and answer session afterwards where we'll engage the panelists in discussion around the subjects we've heard. If you'd like to put some questions in the question and answer at the bottom of your screen, then we'll try and pick them out and direct them towards the person. If you could put the name of the person you'd like to ask the question to as well, we'll see how many of those we can get through. So our subjects this afternoon are best practice of use of Propyzamide, product choice and an IPM approach, and management strategies around IPM. And we're going to start with Joe Martin for Contiva and talk about best practice of Propyzamide. So Joe, I'm going to hand over to you. I'm going to hope the technology works. And if you'd like to take it away, thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Phil. And thanks very much, Neil, for asking me to speak today. So I'm going to try and share my screen and fingers crossed. Hopefully you can all see that.
Yep, that's all good.
Brilliant, great. Okay, so yeah, I'm Joe Martin, recently joined Corteva as arable herbicide field technical manager. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about Propyzamide stewardship and some of the following areas I hope to cover. So I've got a few slides to go through, which we should easily be able to do within the next 10 minutes. So hopefully thinking about how pesticides can reach water, ways in which risks of pesticides reaching water can be minimised, some best practice approaches that Corteva recommend, and some of the initiatives that Corteva are undertaking in this important area for Propyzamide use. So starting off with how pesticides move into water. This can be by a number of routes, as you can see from this slide, and include pesticides being in solution or attached to soil particles, with soil conditions playing a key role, particularly in the autumn and winter. And this can lead to runoff and or erosion from compacted or wet soils, poorly placed tram lines and rainflow losses. Weather conditions also play a key role around application. With incorrect application, the pesticide can enter watercourses from drift and also windy conditions. Soil type can have an effect, with higher losses possible from sandy soils or soils with low organic matter, and some soils such as clays can have direct connection from surface to drains and increasing risk of runoff. So there's a number of routes for pesticides moving into the water. What we can think about, and this is sort of a checklist for high-risk areas, and really it's advised that if we can meet 5 of the criteria that are displayed up here, then the risks to pesticides leaching into water are significantly reduced. And this should be considered before any application is made as part of the planning process. It considers the field situation and field conditions, as well as rainfall potential. And even if only some of the criteria can be met, every little helps. But for Propyzamide, attention to water is paramount, not only when conditions are favourable, as already outlined, but mixing, filling and cleaning with appropriate care to reduce any possible point source contamination is important. So using such things as the Easy Connect system can help. Easy Connect is a closed transfer system that makes filling sprays faster, easier and safer. This next slide is recommendations from Corteva for best practice use of Propyzamide. And it includes applying when soils are moist and cold, with a soil temperature at 30 centimetres depth being a maximum of 10 degrees C and declining. And this means that the roots will stay in contact for longer with the active ingredient. Plants are slower growing, and obviously we do want to avoid frost where there could also be potential for runoff. The maximum rate of propyzamide is 840 grams of active per hectare, and this is for severe blackgrass situations. However, there are other rates that can be used to give effective control of other grass and broadleaf weeds, such as the 750 or the 500 grams of AI. But please always refer to the product label for further advice, or get in touch via our technical hotline, and clearly make use of the Kerb weather app. There's a number of initiatives that at Corteva we're working on in terms of propyzamide stewardship. And this, as I mentioned, includes the Kerb weather app, and we've been making improvements and updating that app recently. So the app will show satellite imagery where you'll be able to drop a pin into individual field locations, as well as having the ability to add in field boundaries that could contain watercourses. And of course, there's a traffic light system, which is determined with the use of soil temperature data at 30 centimetres deep. Other initiatives include seeking to amend labels with propyzamide to clarify the position around double dosing. And we're still waiting on a response from CRD on that request. We're also generating further data on propyzamide blackgrass strategies, as well as working with water companies generating data for mitigating strategies and working with the VI on this very important subject. And we've been working closely with Farmers Weekly Online Learning Centre to produce a course on grass weed control in oilseed rape, propyzamide and best practice, which will be launched soon. So that just gives you a bit of a flavour in some of the stuff that we've been doing. If you want to find out more information and stay informed, then there's a number of links here that you can download, and if you sign up to some of the various weather apps and the Corteva information, then there's also basis points available. So that just gives you a very quick snapshot of the work that we've got ongoing at the moment. So thank you.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Joe. I might just quickly slip in with a quick question, because you were very succinct. Is that Farmers Weekly training like to be free?
I believe so, yes.
Yes. So there was a question in the chat room and question and answers about that. So great. That's great stuff. So thanks very much for kicking us off, Joe. And we'll come back to some more questions a bit later on when we've been through some of the other presentations.
Great.
I'd like to move on now to best practice and use of propyzamide now with Ollie Johnson. And Ollie, if you can share your screen, and it's over to you. I might just add that you call yourself a soil specialist at Agravista, but obviously you're heavily involved in plant protection advice to your growers and farmers.
That's right, yeah. So if I just pop my slide on, hopefully you can all see that.
Indeed, yeah.
Okay, so that's right, Phil. So my actual role within Agravista is twofold. So I'm a soil health specialist within the business. I'm also what we call a key account agronomist. So I look after some of our buying group clients from a commercial and technical perspective nationally as well. So today's presentation, I wanted to really talk about propyzamide and propyzamide really getting into watercourses and how we can manage that from an agronomy and farm perspective. I appreciate that I've actually plagiarized the title of this presentation from a previous one, Curb the Flow. I think it's really pertinent in that we are losing active. There's a flow of actives being revoked. But also we need to try and manage how propyzamide in particular, given how important it's likely to be, how that may flow into watercourses and how we can avoid that where possible. So with that in mind, carbetamide, if you are not already aware, we've got a revocation confirmed. So the final sell-by date of that is the 30th of November 2021. Beyond that, it'll be confined to the history books, like many other products, unfortunately. So you've got 3 weeks if there's stock available to purchase that, and a year to use it. So still some crawl about in places, but generally speaking, it won't be available to use beyond November 2022. So where does that leave us in terms of blackgrass control, in particular any grass weeds, but particularly blackgrass? It's going to leave us in a position where we are reliant on 3 key products, which is 2 of which are propyzamide based and 1 of which is clethodim based. And of course, Clethodim is within the ACCA's group of active ingredients. So it is a product which is liable for resistance, like many others in that family. And so it's something we need to just be mindful of going forward, that it is to go. It also means that our other active ingredient, Propyzamide, is one of the key actives that water companies are concerned about getting into water courses, along with clopyralid and tazoclor, several others, clopyralid, quimirac, and so on and so forth. So it's still a concern, and you can tell by its name, propyzamide, carbetamide, the two are similar actives, and so they use at the same time, similar time of the year. So we do need to be mindful that the same fate that has fallen for carbetamide doesn't fall for propyzamide. So we need to be thinking about how we can best manage the propyzamide problem. And what is the propyzamide problem? This year, so from April 21, so September 20 to April 21, there were 185 detections of propyzamide above the drinking water standard of 0.1 micrograms per litre. Now, to put that into perspective, 0.1 micrograms per litre is effectively the lowest detectable level of understanding. It's one drop in 10 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So, although it is obviously a concern, they are small amounts, but we do need to make sure that we're adhering to the legislation. Of these, the highest was 17.39 micrograms, so nearly 170 times what the maximum dose is. So it's still a concern. And in fact, over the last 7 years, despite all the work that we've been doing as part of the VI and the stewardship that the Corteva and Dow before them have been doing as well, unfortunately, there have been no reductions in propyzamide in water. And this is what is really starting to concern certainly the water companies, that the action we're taking, is it enough? So the question is, do we start taking some more drastic action? And this is some work that I know some people in here may be familiar with. Some work done by Stephen Moss and some of his colleagues at Lobbington and some other farms across the UK. And it really highlights just what some of the other active ingredients bring to the party in terms of blackgrass control. So to get your eye in, that first bar on the left is amount of blackgrass plants, the population. So we've got a blackgrass population of 160 per metre squared. This is the oilseed rape crop. Now that's high, but it's not untypical for blackgrass, for an oilseed rape field here in the UK, certainly not where I am in the Midlands. And it shows there the next bar, an addition of clethodim. So this is straight Centurion Max effectively. And you can see that's brought that blackgrass control down by about 85%. So we've got 85% control. That population's been reduced significantly. So it shows just what clethodim on its own can do. But of course, we don't use clethodim on its own. We don't apply Centurion Max in the tank on its own. We often use a water conditioner. So you may be using Exchange, Stingray, Exclude, whatever it might be. And just look what that brings to the party. On its own, we're going from 160 plants there or thereabouts to 3.5 plants. So a 98% reduction in the blackgrass population. Now, with that, you can then start to see and compare what propyzamide does. So propyzamide 500 grams is equivalent to a litre dose, and a litre dose will get that down to about 17.3. The 1.4 dose, 6.3, and the full rate, 4.3. So even full rate propyzamide is not delivering in this trial the same as what clethodim is on its own. And of course, sequence it, we're getting much better levels of control. So clethodim followed by propyzamide is reducing that blackgrass in this trial to 0. And even going forward by adding in higher doses of propyzamide, even carbetamide, we're still not seeing significantly better levels of control. The message here is not to go ahead and cut your propyzamide doses. We're not saying that. What we're saying, and to be clear here, is that if you've got good control of volunteers, if you've got good control of blackgrass from your Centurion Max and pre-em herbicides where you're using them, and any cultural controls that you may be doing, then it may be appropriate to reduce your propyzamide dose. The trouble is that at the moment, people are reaching for that 1.4 and 1.7 dose as a matter of practice, and we aren't making that assessment of whether the clethodim on its own may have done an adequate level of control. So have a discussion with your agronomists, see if the dose rate you're using is appropriate, and don't blanket it. If it needs to be a certain dose rate here, maybe 1.7, if you've got a particularly bad problem, then we're going to have to use that. But if we've got blackgrass populations which are much lower, then you may be able to cut it down to 1.4, even a litre. So there are options available, and really it's just about understanding how we can use those before reaching for the propyzamide. So I won't invite any questions now, but at the end, I'm sure we'll have some in the chat that we can go through, and happy to talk through some of those ideas.
Thank you very much indeed, Ollie. That's great. Thanks for adding to the presentations there, and thanks for reminding me as well of the sleepless nights I had dreaming of blackgrass at 150 plants per meter squared. Yeah, so many sleepless nights on there, and Neil's background picture as well has got some blackgrass swaying in the wind as well. So we can see what we're up against here around things like resistance, and I think it'll be a common theme, and perhaps we'll revisit it in the questions around the use of clethodim and the use of Kerb and Propyzamide as a follow-up in there. So thanks very much indeed, Ollie. I'm going to move on now to Spencer. And Spencer Collins, you're Senior Plant Health Advisor at the NFU. And Spencer, we've had many conversations around IPM plans and the development of IPM plans. And you're going to take us through some management strategies that can be evolved and the use of the IPM plan going forward.
Yep.
So the stage is yours, Spencer.
Okay, cheers. Thank you. Hopefully I can share my screen. If it's doing anything. Yeah,
it's looking good.
Yeah, good. Okay, yeah. So thanks for inviting me to talk, Phil and Neil. So I'm going to talk about a year in the revised IPM plan. So we released a new revised IPM plan, not quite a year, it was December last year. And if you don't know your score, I suggest you fill it in and understand what your IPM score is. Hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll know what I'm talking about. So I thought I'd quickly just go into what IPM is. So it's not a new concept. A lot of agricultural research looked into integrated pest management, as you can see from the book from 1976. And actually a lot of farmers and growers are already doing agronomic practices that can be considered IPM. We just don't really label it as such as cultivation techniques to reduce pests or diseases, the use of resistant cultivars, and also hygiene measures to prevent spread of pests. So recently we've been having a lot more talk about integrated pest management in the last few years. This can be potentially, it's caused by the release of the Sustainable Use Directive. So the European legislation came into force in 2009, and this is where the idea of integrated pest management was brought in. So anyone who was using professional plant protection products would have to use integrated pest management. One of the overarching theme is to ensure sustainable use, but it also, in the realm of integrated pest management, there was an emphasis of growing healthy crops with little disruption to agroecosystems and encouraging natural pest control. So that's a direct quote from the directive. The directive also, in one of its annexes, talks about the 8 aspects or 8 pillars, you could say, of integrated pest management. And you can boil it down to these points here, really. So you've got prevent. People should prevent pests and diseases or weeds. I should really say here that pests in this context, you can assume that weeds, diseases, and invertebrate pests are all considered pests. Sorry. So prevent them entering. Detect, you must monitor, you must really know what pest levels are in your fields. And also you must then produce thresholds. So you need to know when you're going to control these pests. With respect to control methods of pests, you must prefer biological, physical, and non-chemical. They must be specific for the target. So you do not want to impact non-target organisms. You should only apply when necessary. And also you should consider the evolution of resistance in pests. Another aspect is assess. So you must really assess your integrated pest management plan. you should evaluate it, you should understand whether the control methods you've done are actually successful, do they work, which allows you to be successful in managing pest issues in your crops. So how can you measure IPM? And if measuring IPM allows you to sort of record it and document IPM, it's not the easiest thing. However, a recent paper by Henry Chryson looked into this and developed a really good method to quantify the adoption of IPM in farm management systems. It looked at the pillars of IPM I mentioned, so prevent, detect, control, and assess. And it asks farmers how they follow those areas, and it allows the quantification of the sort of the ultimate potential of IPM, and it will give you a score on 0 to 100. So taking that, the work that Henry Chryson did, we being Henry helped us with this work, and also the voluntary initiative and NFU, we designed an IPM plan, which will hopefully it does allow farmers to demonstrate their full implementation of IPM, and it records all the aspects of pest management, and such as I described, the prevent, detect, control, assess. This then is documented, and it provides assurance that we're following sustainable use of plant protection products, following the Sustainable Use Directive, and it produces an IPM score for the growers, which allows them to evaluate their practices and also look at improving and developing IPM in the future. So as I mentioned, we released our broadacre plan in December last year, and that was closely followed by later in the year by the grassland plan. So grassland obviously is often concentrated on weed management. So that plan focuses on integrated weed management. We also hopefully we plan on releasing a horticulture plan. We've been working on it recently. As you can imagine, IPM in horticulture can be very developed, especially in protected environments. But currently you can, if you're a horticulture grower, use the broadacre plan because it's still relevant to your business and does measure IPM. So the following year, we've had over 3,000 broadacre plans completed, less for the grassland plan at 215. There's been a range. The distribution of scores, as you can see below in this chart, the average is around 60. And we do get quite good scores of IPM, which shows that IPM is being implemented at quite high standards throughout industry. And most growers are performing some part of IPM. I would like to point out that the grassland plan, less people have filled them out. So it does allow us to focus on grassland users of PPPs going forward. So the IPM plan, it allows a person to improve year on year. Once you fill out the plan, some feedback is given to promote increased implementation of IPM going forward. And we can, looking at the results from the people who implement the plan, we can focus knowledge transfer that will have the greatest impact. For example, a recent work looking at results of scores from grass and potatoes showed that grass generally score lower scores. So that means we can focus some education and knowledge transfer to grassland. We intend to improve the IPM plans going forward. We'll be releasing a horticultural plan soon. We would also like to focus feedback onto promoting aspects of IPM that are taken, well, they are not taken up as much as they can be. And also we would like to focus it on new research and promote it across grower groups. This work also allows us to understand barriers to uptake of IPM, and recent work has found that economics or lack of knowledge and experiences are some of the reasons people do not take it up. So there's potential here for incentives for economic incentives to allow people to take IPM up, and also sharing knowledge. One of the aspects of Henry's work shows that grower group discussions really does initiate IPM farmer. So thank you. Hopefully I've explained the IPM plan, aspects of the IPM in Sustainable Use Directive, and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Spencer. And I got thrown out the webinars for a little bit of that, but hopefully I'm back in now. So we've had three talks there on our webinar. And just before I go to questions, I'm just going to turn to Neil Evans, who's works with the VI as our Chief Operating Officer. And Neil, I wonder whether you might just say, why is this subject and water protection so important to the VI in general?
Well, basically, Phil, it's one of our main aims is to of the VI is to help protect various aspects of the environment, and obviously the water and rivers is one of the aspects that we really try and focus on. And it's quite interesting that whilst Spencer was just talking there, I was just looking at the list of attendees and those who are on this call. And there's a lot of people from the water industry here, and we do try and work, fairly closely with them, mainly through Water UK, to try and make a difference across the agricultural industry.
So it's good that actually that working with the water industry across to agronomists, across to those who are manufacturers as well, and growers and spray operators who are applying this, that this is a joined up discussion we're having here about making sure that we have best practice here and minimize the impacts. And I see on your screen behind you about protection of soil and water in the wider environment. It's really key to get that message across all those who are using plant protection products, and especially Propyzamide and some of its features that make it, it's a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde in the fact that, it does flow quite across the surface, but it also lingers on into the following crop as well. I wonder whether we might, I'm really looking at Joe and Ollie here, whether we might just have a look at the use of clethodim as well, and about effectiveness of early clethodim use, and perhaps when soils are warmer, and the fact you can get some reasonable control out of it. I mean, Joe, what do you think about the impact of combinations of clethodim before Propyzamide? Do you think we've got enough of that message out into the industry?
I think there is some messaging out there about it. We certainly see clethodim fits into that early stage when soils are warm, and we certainly wouldn't be recommending application of Propyzamide at that early timing if the soils haven't reached down to the right temperature. So there's certainly a place for that in the market.
Yeah, and Ollie, what about yourself? What would you say? We discussed the work that Stephen Moss had done at a number of sites around the United Kingdom, and the difficulty, of course, is that because blackgrass, even when you get down to low numbers in plants per meter squared, it's sort of almost like an insurance spraying to make sure we get every last bit. How can we be confident? I mean, of balancing those two active ingredients together?
I think you've got to have a look and see, and it does involve, actually getting into the field and making that decision before we reach that kind of curve. It shouldn't be an automatic decision. And I think as well, it's about having that conversation with your grower, with your agronomist, I should say, and this should be a two-way conversation to say, well, as a grower, I'm prepared to take a risk here. What do you think as the agronomist? Because there is a lot of recommendations which are made, certainly around Propyzamide, I think, that are to avoid the risk things going wrong. I'd sooner get that Propyzamide on there, and then if there is blackgrass, well, I can say I've done everything I can. And it's just about having that discussion about where you want to position your risk as well. Clethodim's got a really big part to play, and we've seen that, in this presentation, we've seen it before. And used properly, you can really get some good results and reduce your blackgrass levels. So the need to use Kerb is reduced. I think from an agronomy perspective as well, there is a lot of talk in the market about going early. And Joe, you guys, you've got your own advice about this, and it does get thrown about a little bit. When we apply in Kerb, we're balancing the size of the plant, and we're balancing, this is the size of the blackgrass, the residual activity we're going to get, and trying to think about how that can impact on when we time that propyzamide application. Sometimes going earlier, potentially with a lower dose, could mean that you're not getting that residual activity through the winter. And that is a risk as well. Leaving it later and having to go for a higher dose because you've got larger blackgrass plants, but that increases the risk of excess runoff and leaching. So there's a lot to play and think about and discuss with your agronomist to make this decision about what the appropriate dose is.
So let's just expand that a little bit and say, we've started with a talk on propyzamide and product, but let's rewind it a little bit and start with Spencer's approach and talk about IPM. There are a lot of things that we can do around, rotation and around cultural control. A crop competition is one that I might just give an example of this year, for example. Fallows, using agri-environment schemes. Spencer talked about prevention and hygiene. This isn't just every time we reduce blackgrass control, we reduce the need to use other interventions, don't we?
Yeah, and I think we need to start right at the beginning, because oilseed rape is seen as being a blackgrass tidying crop, and that we can do what we like in the preceding crop to a certain extent because we've got Kerb. And that we've got Centuria Max. That's going to get us out of a bugger's muddle when it comes to the following crop. And we need to think carefully about whether, if we have got a blackgrass population, with the thoughts on preserving these active ingredients, whether it's appropriate to put an oilseed rape crop in the ground if it's destined to have a high dose of Kerb to control the blackgrass. If it's feasible that we can control it in other ways and we have to then reach for the propyzamide, that's different. But if we know we've got a blackgrass problem in that field, then, as you say, Phil, there are other options to control it other than trying to put a crop in the ground. I appreciate that's difficult from a financial perspective, but when we're thinking purely about the preserving of active ingredients and molecules, we need to think carefully about, are we putting the right crop in the ground then? In terms of other cultural things we can be doing, if in terms of blackgrass, again, in the previous crop, and certainly making sure managing out that blackgrass population in the previous crop is really important as well. There are fallows we can do as well. That's another option. More people have drilled earlier this year, which produces a more competitive crop. That can produce problems of its own in an oilseed rape crop, granted, but it certainly, from a blackgrass perspective, produces a more vigorous stand early on, which is really useful.
Yeah, I might just turn on that IPM approach and those things for a question we've got here. It'd be interesting to know what level of uptake there is around the 8 steps, Spencer, of the IPM as it's defined, because we might find that a number of growers can get 3, 4, or 5 of them, but do we put all 8 of them into practice? And I wonder whether there's any scope for us extracting that out in the future about how we get those last, a complete picture on some of these fields.
Yeah, so you're right that some aspects of the, so in sustainable use, we've got 8 of them. Some are more common than others. So with the IPM plans, we can actually look at and see which are there areas in the industry that we're sort of not embracing as much. For example, the resistance strategy is probably taken on quite well, considering that you don't want to have resistance. We know that with the blackgrass and how devastating it can be if resistance evolves in a population. But also, I think we're not really fully maximizing on assessing. I think we really need to understand what control methods work. Research looking into new potential control methods can actually be really beneficial. So hopefully we'll be developing IPM plans in the future for cabbage stem flea beetle, for example. Also prevention. Prevention it can be difficult for some diseases, but I think we can, one of the ones we can do is detect. So monitoring the use of the aphid suction trap, for example, monitoring. There's disease monitoring systems going ahead, and hopefully we can maximize on that.
Okay, let's just, Joe, I'm going to bring you in here now. We've got a few questions coming in here about, and indeed one from Stephen Moss, who has joined us now, is about, actually making some real difference in here. How are we going to make some actual tangible difference to this? So, and it ties in with another question that came in about labeling, about soil and weather conditions rather than arbitrary rates on arbitrary cutoff dates. There's a lot of pressure with a cutoff date coming, where sometimes it starts to override all the things that we could do around soil conditions, and it may well be that those conditions would be better in a week or two's time if we had ways of extending that period after a certain cutoff date, or going when soils are slightly warmer. What are your thoughts on that, Joe, about rather than just dates?
I mean, the term arbitrary, I wouldn't say they're arbitrary dates. The dates are driven by the gap, and certainly all of the studies that Corteva produce data on, and the modelling, etc., that's done is done to fit within that gap. Where we, as an organisation, then try and focus people is to actually use the Kerb weather app and the Kerb weather data information that's put out as additional technical information for people to get the best use of that product, I would say. I would imagine from a regulatory viewpoint, it would be very difficult to set specific labels that purely were based on soil temperature or weather forecasts, etc.
But it may well be that, for example, there is always some label recommendations about what cultivations should follow Kerb applications, and perhaps some leeway around dates, but actually saying, quite frankly, if you don't cultivate, then it's not just advisory, or we could probably get a longer period and be under less pressure from weather if we could find a way of getting more incorporation perhaps of the products in the next crop, or change what we're growing after oilseed rape.
Yeah, and again, all of that, what crop can be put in after the crop that's been treated, that's all data that is generated during the registration process. So and those studies are very in-depth and expensive studies to make sure that we can get that, what crops can be put in, and make sure that there isn't damage to following crops.
So Spencer and Ollie, I'm going to come to you from a question here about what are the top cultural controls would you recommend that a water company could encourage or subsidize in a sensitive water catchment area? For example, legume fallows at a better rate than countryside stewardship offers, for example. So I wonder if you've got any ideas. I'll start with you, Ollie, about what measures you think could encourage people around sensitive water catchments.
I think one of the key things, and it's been alluded to in some of the questions that are coming through, is that it's important to point out that one of the ways that propyzamide gets into water is it's carried on soil particles. As it gets eroded, it's carried with it. And so we need to think about it in the same way as you would trying to manage soil surface runoff. And that includes things like expanding your margins. It includes things like having grass margins, margins where you can sort of catch and slow, anything you can do to slow down that surface runoff. So putting tram lines against the slope rather than down the slope, for example. Trying to ensure that when you're creating your seed bed, that you're creating a seed bed that isn't going to suddenly cap, and you're going to have a nice surface that's nice and smooth, that it's going to run straight into a water course. So I think anything that can be subsidised to help support farmers that are going to have to accept that they're going to get a lower crop area because they're sacrificing it for margins. I think that would be a useful one to start with, and to encourage people to reduce the area and to expand their margins effectively.
So Spencer, the use of agri-environment schemes around catch crops and cover crops and buffers might be a way of helping us mitigate that or might come as a recommendation to growers to stop this mobility or reduce it, the mobility to water?
Yeah, so there are talks of the ELM going forward, the water buffers for environment schemes. So they would offer benefit to ensuring pesticides do not reach watercourses. So that would be beneficial. I know that buffer zones are being reviewed by CRD. So potentially going forward, we could have more, I wouldn't say detailed, but at the best way I can find more detailed buffer zones, or sort of a more encompassing buffer zones for most products. But yeah, I agree with everything Ollie said. Yeah,
it would be interesting to see if there's any work done. I certainly haven't come across any specifically work that's done about the effect of companion plants. We use them a lot for, perhaps deterring pests or repelling pests from the rape, or adding nitrogen in the case of a legume, but perhaps something that we could use lower level within a canopy at the point of with their sort of the curb time, which might try to sort of bind the soil together a little better, help slow down that runoff of soil particles in the same way you would for surface runoff. I've not come across anything, but it might be something that we could look at, and maybe that could be something to subsidise.
Yeah, just say, Ollie, that in terms of companion cropping is certainly something that we're looking at Corteva at the moment. So yeah,
that'd be interesting to see. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so if we look around some of the subjects around, I mean, I don't know if anybody on the panel here knows about substituting potentially, detections of propyzamide or clethodim as well. If we go for more clethodim, are we likely to end up with more water detections of clethodim, or do we think that clethodim has probably got a lower mobility? I don't know, Joe, if you know any work on that, or what we might be picking up on that.
No, sorry, Phil. I mean, the biggest thing for us is that we know that in terms of propyzamide, that the biggest correlation that we see with propyzamide in water is when there's very heavy rainfall events that we're seeing more and more of at the moment. So that's the sort of the knowledge that we've got. And yeah, whether or not clethodim, you would see increases in that if there's more use of that, I wouldn't know at the present time.
Yeah, so I suppose really as well, there's a couple of questions in here about groundwater and surface water and drain flow as well. A number of the things we've talked about, Ollie, have been about A, rotational, B, the opportunity to reduce dose rate, but secondly, have good crop competition as well. So if we get periods that are coming up towards the end of January where the ground is waterlogged, we really should be sending out a message that actually, if you've got a big problem and we're getting to the end of that window with what I would consider to be a fairly reasonable autumn that we've had so far, then we should really be looking seriously about whether we're applying up against a date, at the end of January for these, because of these other ways of propyzamide getting into water.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point because blackgrass is a marsh grass. It grows where the conditions are wet, which actually when we look at propyzamide are exactly the conditions where you don't want to be applying it. So the two don't go well together, and so it's about finding a good compromise. Now, we all know which fields are more susceptible to waterlogging, and that's where you can make those decisions about perhaps bringing forward that curb application if the conditions are right to do so. So if, for example, you've got the right temperature, you're looking at residual effect. But if it is likely that it's going to get absolutely waterlogged within a short time from applying it, then yeah, it's probably a product that is too risky to apply in those circumstances. And yeah, it's a difficult decision to make, but we have to think about the longevity of the product, not just about our own farms. And I think that's something we need to together as an industry to get across, that we can only continue if we all get on board with this.
Joe, just looking at, we had heard a question about weather and soil conditions on labels, and how difficult it might be to get that change. What about things that make propyzamide less mobile? So is there anything we can do in formulation? Is there anything we can do with adjuvants in the fact that we could make it less mobile? Do you think there's any scope for that, or do you think that the amount of product there is on sale, or you know, the way we get to that is fraught with too much expense, or is it something we should be looking at?
I mean, formulation is something that I think all of the manufacturers look at on a regular basis to make sure the formulation of products is as best as it can be. In terms of propyzamide, it isn't actually that mobile in water. It attaches quite well to soil particles, which is what we want when we're trying to form that layer for control. So I think the actual formulation in this case is pretty good. Certainly the Kerb flow and the AstroKerb.
Yeah, Neil, I believe we've got some data on clethodim detection. So I mean, that might be useful just to share that. There's another question that's just come in around any thoughts on mechanical control of blackgrass, such as mold draining. We've seen good results on stopping blackgrass before it gets out of control. Having a low percentage of blackgrass overall in the field problem helps with the efficacy of chemicals. I should just say that actually it's where you mold plow in your rotation as well. You know, mold plowing before the use of before oilseed rape is not recommended, because obviously there's a quicker route to water. But I think in other parts of the rotation, what do we think about that, Ollie, as a process?
Yeah, it comes back to that point again that, you know, blackgrass is a marsh grass, and preventing that waterlogging in those wet conditions is effectively making the soil less suitable to a blackgrass plant. And anything that you can do to help that, you know, help reduce the population, puts less strain on any herbicides that you need to apply, and can mean then you can reduce doses where appropriate. So yes, there's definitely points in that. Caveat though to any cultivation is just, we have to remember that if we are going to use Kerb, it's dependent on the blackgrass being in that top 2.5 to 5, which between 2.5 to 5 centimeters in depth. So, you know, from the surface to 5 centimeters. If you're doing any sort of deep cultivations or stirring the soil up to try and, you know, perhaps chip the blackgrass, or to try and, you know, maybe plowing, what you can then do is get blackgrass right the way through the soil profile. You then put oilseed rape in the ground, and you extend the emergence time for when that blackgrass is likely to come out. So rather than getting a uniform emergence, which we can then control with Kerb later, you get a gradual emergence, which means we have blackgrass that's much larger later in the season and continues to emerge. So just thinking about the cultivations as well before we put the oilseed rape in, certainly, you know, direct drilling and keeping the blackgrass in that surface zone is really important, not just to help the blackgrass, but it helps the Kerbers work as well. As I understand, I think that's right, Joe.
Yeah, Spencer, I was just going to come back to you on some of the points around IPM, and you touched in your presentation on some of the things about resistance to diseases, pests, and weeds, and an IPM approach does take an overarching and holistic look at a whole rotation, doesn't it? And so there are a lot of management skills that need to go into IPM. You know, you said about measuring the unmeasurable, but also it takes, you know, this IPM that is very much in the news at the moment. It takes a lot of input from farmers to try and put all those blocks together, doesn't it?
Yeah, you're right. You really need to understand your crop and the pests that come into the crop. It's not gone are the days that we can just apply one insecticide, one broad spectrum. We have loss of actives. We care much more about the environment. We don't want to have non-target effects. So we need to really target the insecticides, for example, on what, if it is a sucking pest, if it's a chewing pest, you would reach for a different insecticide. Also, the timings, you need to make sure if the timing of the application is at the right life cycle. There's no point spraying for a lepidopteran pest on the leaves if it's pupating in the soil, for example. Also, we really need to maximize on biopesticides going forward. They're encouraged in IPM, in the Sustainable Use Directive. Also, we need to sort of understand how to use them better. A good project run by AHDB was Amber, who was looking at it mainly from protected crops, but we should really think about broadacre crops and how we can use them. Yeah, I think you're right. We really do need to understand the systems we have. And I think we should be embracing it. We should want to understand the systems. Understanding it is good. We can get more out of if we understand what pressures they're under and how to most efficiently overcome them.
And Spencer, just as you were talking there, I was just going to ask a question about in our agricultural transition that we're going into now in Elms and away from BPS and our associated with CAP and that support system. How do you think the role of IPM is perceived by, DEFRA? Because there's talk about supporting it and pushing it forward. Do you think we need to be a bit clearer about what that support looks like in the future to the industry from DEFRA and government?
Yeah, so at the moment, DEFRA is doing a test and trial on IPM to see how they could potentially support it going forward, if they could. And we really need to make sure we're supporting the right aspects. So can we support in, for example, ensuring that natural beneficial predators and parasitoids are promoted in the fields with buffer strips, for example, specific ones, are they being paid for? Or the use of biopesticides, the use of low-risk products could be supported. We're currently looking to see how we can go forward, but as you can imagine, there's a lot to investigate with the new environmental land management scheme that will come into force.
Okay. Neil, what I'm going to suggest now is, obviously this is one of a series of webinars that we've been doing, and it would be quite good to get from the people who are attending here at the moment a little bit of feedback about what you might like to see next. So just before I go back to the panel and ask them for one key factor that if they were to promote it on the top of their list of things to do about responsible use of propyzamide and how we can reduce its impact, I'm just going to see, Neil, do you think we could share a poll and see what subject would our audience like to discuss in some, perhaps going forward after in the new year, around the roles of best practice and IPM and responsible use of plant protection products? Is it possible to share that, Neil?
Yeah, I'm just launching a poll now. So here you go. If you could all vote appropriately, that would be much appreciated.
So if you'd like to look at more about soil protection, or we'd like to explore biostimulants and biopesticides, would we like to do some more work on field applications? Would we, when it finally comes out, explain the National Action Plan? What does it look like? And how can we manage either public perception or to ensure consumers and those that look from the outside about how responsible we are with our industry. So I'm going to just give people a few more seconds to. So if we keep that up while we just go round. There's one last question here about the reasons for carbapetamide being revoked. Does anybody can answer that one at all?
I do not think it was supported at renewal.
Okay, right. Well, we're beginning to get some. We're getting a 40% on biopesticides and biostimulants and soil protection as well. In fact, we may well cover all these subjects, but we may well cover them in the order of and if there's anything else that you'd like to cover in there, please do put it in the chat room. But I'd just like to take the opportunity now to go round and start with you, Joe, about if there's one thing you'd recommend, or it may well be that we've got to stack them all. What would you recommend to our audience listening today about how we can really make a tangible difference and try and get away from and reducing the impact that we have on water?
I don't think it's one simple answer, Phil. I think it's using the whole strategy approach, which we sort of discussed today. using some of the IPM systems that Spencer's been talking about and Ollie's been talking about as well. And it's about all of the different stakeholders working together still. And certainly we're seeing that with some of the work that we've been doing with the water companies in that approach. And I think that's, you know, it has to be the way forward. It's not just one simple answer.
Yeah. And Ollie, I dare say you will concur with Joe on this, but is there anything that sort of things that you're looking at in more detail and that you'd like to highlight?
Well, I think this year in particular, and of course the elephant in the room this year is that actually propyzamide is incredibly short, and it's going to put pressure on some people to reduce doses because, you know, there's going to be no choice. And it's for the first time in a long time where clients and I are having to have that discussion to say, you know, where we're going to reduce it, where we're going to prioritize the higher doses, where we're going to prioritize the lower doses, where do we not need to use it. And so I think if I had, you know, there isn't one thing, but one of the key things I think is just to do that going forward when Kerb, even when Kerb's more available, to walk the fields carefully with your agronomist, decide what the risk is. And if we need to use it, we do. If we don't, we can reduce the dose, then do so, and try and vary the dose across the farm and just try and minimize its use where appropriate, provided that you've achieved adequate control elsewhere.
Thanks, Ollie. And finally, to Spencer, what would be a sort of, you know, a top area that you would concentrate on?
I think, to be honest with you, I think just look at integrated pest management in general. Are we really using everything? Are we preventing, detecting, controlling, and assessing everything? And make sure that we should be thinking about all of those aspects to effectively control. And we might be missing a trick by missing one of those aspects.
Okay. Well, I mean, it just leaves me to say, really, I mean, the involvement of IPM plans, really, Spencer, is going to be crucial going forward, I think, showing the way we approach this subject. So I would encourage people to fill those scores in, because there's now a metric in there that's looking at a score for IPM. I think it's well worth visiting the NFU website or the VI website and scoring those plans. And I hope everybody, or most people on here, if you're an agronomist or a grower, you've done your plan. I really would encourage that from the VI's point of view. I would also, you know, re-emphasize the message about how we really have got to make you know, reduce propyzamide in water. Otherwise, you know, we're going to be facing, you know, some issues around its availability in the future, and we've already seen with other things that are withdrawn from the market. So I cannot stress enough that we, you know, as much as we can about discussing all these subjects, looking around many things we can do before we you know, go in, apply when conditions possibly aren't right. We should look at them. So I would encourage that take-home message. Neil, is there anything you would like to say around basis points or Naroso or anything else that we may have missed out?
Hopefully, as I've put in the chat, those who require a basis point or a Naroso point have completed their membership number during the registration process. So if you have, that's all automated. If you haven't, then you can email me via the VI website. The only other thing I was just typing in the chat there is that Jonathan Newman, as I said, has sent some clethodim data through, but I don't seem to be able to cut and paste it into the chat. So what I'll do is I'll insert the appropriate point when we were talking about that issue in the video recording, which will be available on YouTube and via the VI website in the next day or two.
Okay, well, and I see you've put in there about oilseed rape, herbicides, and think water. The VI website is full of best practice and information which I would recommend to all growers and agronomists to look at and try and convey those messages out on the ground. It's a really important part of what we do at the VI around promoting that best practice. That only leaves me to say thank you very much to Joe, to Ollie, and to Spencer. Thank you very much, Neil, for making the IT work seamlessly, and even the poll worked pretty good. Thank you very much to all those of you that attended. Sorry we didn't get through all the questions. There are some things in the chat room even still coming in. But thank you very much. It's turned 5 o'clock on the nose. I'd like to wish you a very good evening and hope you'll join us the next time we have another VI webinar. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Thank you.